And Craig Smith is Bill's friend and co-author. They spent about 3 years researching and writing the book, and we've all seen the title of that, Reaching Net Zero. Bill retired as a senior vice president at Rockwell International, and he works in research and development and also business planning. Craig has his PhD, so we welcome Dr. Smith. And he was an assistant professor of engineering at UCLA. He co-founded his own firm, and he retired as president and chairman of an international engineering and big company. So they both have extensive experience as engineers, senior executives, and engineering projects in the US and overseas. So we are going to learn, certainly I'm going to learn because I know nothing about global warming. So thanks the two gentlemen, and we appreciate the fact that they're joining us today and that they're going to enlighten us. So take it, gentlemen.
Well, thanks, Bobbit, and thanks Encore for the opportunity to present, to give this presentation. And I should add that if anybody knows of other groups that would like to have a similar presentation, just let us know. We really want to get the word out on global warming. And the presentation that we're going to give you today is a brief summary and does not cover the full contents of our book, which is Reaching Net Zero, What It Takes to Solve the Global Climate Crisis. There's been a lot written about global warming. There's a lot of ain't it awful kind of books, and the world's coming to an end. Our book is a complete treatment of the subject, but Craig and I felt there was a void in the sense that what can and should we actually do about the problem? And that's what we have tried to focus on. Our book was published in 2020 by Elsevier, a Dutch company. They're a major international publisher of technical and scientific books and journals. And I'd say that, global warming has been an issue that's been around for really a long time, over 30 years, but it's been ignored for at least 30 years in the US. However, excuse the pun, it's getting to be a pretty hot topic. Craig and I have divided our presentation into two parts, and I'll now like to turn over my friend and co-author, Craig, who will give the start of the presentation.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you all from Encore for joining us and giving us this opportunity to tell you what we've been working on. We've been very concerned about our planet and what's happening, not so much for ourselves as for future generation. We consider that we're not going to be impacted like others. Will be likely long gone. But we are concerned about a future for our grandchildren and the younger generations regarding the world that awaits them. We'd like to explain a little bit about the science behind global warming without getting real technical. And the first topic is shown in this slide. Is it really real? We talk to people all the time. We say, oh, I don't think it's a real thing. It's just natural. Well, we think that evidence today is irrefutable. More frequent and intense storms. We're having very hard storms in terms of tornadoes and so on. And now, right now, the East is blanketed with one of the worst winter storms that's occurred in decades. Of course, California, we had 4 million acres burned last summer, amazing wildfires that we've never had before. We have destruction of coral reefs taking place due to ocean acidification and flooding. And in this slide, the picture of flooding, that's my street where I live in Newport. And my house is 10 feet above mean sea level. So I know I have to be concerned about rising seas. The recent increase in the Earth's temperature was one of the things that really got Bill and my attention. The average temperature of the Earth before the Industrial Revolution was about 14 degrees centigrade, or about 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And that temperature is determined by thousands of measurements made all around the world by different organizations, and then all put together to come up with one average number. So today it's increased by 1.2 degrees centigrade, or about 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. In parallel with this, the ocean temperatures also increased 0.8 degrees centigrade, about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's projected to reach 3 degrees centigrade by 2100. Also significant is the fact the Arctic is heating twice as fast as the rest of the Earth. So we're seeing this retreat of glaciers all over the world. Scientists are actually predicting when Glacier Park in the US will no longer have a single glacier. And the ocean has been rising, not much so far, about 10 inches, but it could reach 3 feet by 2100. And at 3 feet higher sea level, you'll see a lot of Florida and parts of California will be underwater and uninhabitable. So other people we talk to also think that this is just a natural thing. We can't do anything about it. The Earth gets hotter, the Earth gets colder, and so what? And that actually is true. If you look at this slide, you can see the cycles that have occurred for the past 350,000 years. The Earth got very warm, then it got very cold, and it got very warm again. And that takes about 100,000 years. And it's due to variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. The Earth's orbit isn't a perfect circle, it's elliptical. There are periods of time when it gets closer to the sun, farther away, and so on. And the effect of those is to change the Earth's temperature. The other thing that happens, if we look back at this history, we can see that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere never really exceeded 300 parts per million. Whereas if you look at the extreme right-hand side of the slide, you see suddenly the amount of carbon in the atmosphere has shot up to 414 parts per million in a period that corresponds to about 150 years. Basically, that is the time since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what's driving this increase in energy use? Well, it's two main things. One is the growth in population globally, and the second thing is rising living standards. As people become wealthier, they use more energy. It might be, for example, they buy a motor scooter or vehicle or appliances, a refrigerator. At the same time, more people in the world are using more energy. So the effect of rising living standards is that the per capita energy use is increasing along with per capita wealth, and commensurately also carbon dioxide emissions. If you look at the small curve in the upper left corner of this graph, you see population growth mapped against world energy consumption. And it's amazing how closely these two curves follow each other. So the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is attributable to human use of fossil fuels. There can be little doubt about that today. If you take the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced by burning 1 ton of coal or 1 barrel of oil and determine how much of that goes into the atmosphere, you can match that data with what we measure in the atmosphere. And of course, they're very close. So it's evident that it's primarily our combustion of fossil fuels that's causing the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What is net zero? Bill mentioned that's in the title of our book. And we'd like to be clear what that term means. Basically, the objective of net zero is to reach a point where global emissions are totally stopped. That's a difficult goal. As you can see in this slide, we are today releasing, in 2019, the world released 55 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases, primarily from fossil fuel combustion and from agriculture. To reduce that huge quantity to net zero requires that any greenhouse gases we produce on Earth somehow have to be stopped. Well, it's not going to be possible to stop everything. So to reach net zero, the gases that we cannot eliminate from going into the atmosphere have to be somehow absorbed on Earth, sequestered in trees, or otherwise reduced from the atmosphere and stored underground. That's easy to say, but it's very hard to do. And we have not seen any way to do that on a large scale economically so far. Bill created an analog, an analogy that's helpful to understand this. We call it the sticky accelerator problem. Basically, what it means is we can speed up global warming, but we can't slow it down or stop. It's like a car where the accelerator can make the car go faster, but it doesn't retract to slow down. And there are no brakes. In other words, if greenhouse gas emissions cease, their effects, global warming, will persist for hundreds of years until these gases are slowly reduced naturally. Another thing that we're concerned about is latency. Latency is basically a delay between cause and effect. We're concerned that latency may imply future problems for the planet. For example, damage associated with melting ice will take a while before we see it as sea level rise. Likewise, there are other effects where the effects are going to be delayed. This slide is an example of latency. It shows that in 1960 was a time when cigarette consumption in the US finally began to decline. But if you look at the blue curve, the death rate due to lung cancer didn't actually start to decline until 25 years later. This is a pretty good example of what we mean by latency. So where do the greenhouse gases come from? And what's causing global warming? Well, the major one is carbon dioxide, which is about 76% of all greenhouse gases. Most of that comes from fossil fuel use, with about a fourth from agriculture, forestry, land use changes, and other minor effects. The gases other than carbon dioxide that we're most concerned about are methane and nitrous oxides, and to a very small extent, fluorinated gases primarily used in industry. Methane is a smaller percentage, but it's a very important greenhouse gas. And it's interesting, if you look at the little figure in the lower left of this chart, you can see that if we took all of the world's cattle and considered them a country, they would rank third in greenhouse gas emissions, primarily methane and carbon dioxide. Fortunately, not all of the heat produced by global warming by greenhouse gases goes into the Earth's atmosphere. About 30% goes into the oceans, and about 30% is absorbed on the Earth in plants and soil. However, of the heat produced by global warming, 90% goes into the oceans, and the oceans have been steadily warming. In a way, that's fortunate, because were it not for the heat absorbed in the oceans, our atmosphere would be much warmer. But there's some significant effects associated with ocean warming. One is, as the water gets warmer, it expands and the sea level rises. Secondly, warming of the oceans has a big effect on fisheries. what are the main sources of greenhouse gases and emissions? Well, actually, it used to be the US was the number one, but we were surpassed a few years ago by China. Today, China produces 30% of all the greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. The US is second with about 15%, and another 5 countries, India, Russia, Japan, Iran, Germany, release the balance of that. Significantly, though, the US produces 3 times per capita what the rest of the world does on average, and twice what China does. So per capita, the US is still a major emitter. And it's going to take all of these countries working together to solve this problem. Obviously, the large industrial countries like China, the US, and the European Union have the resources, the technical know-how to solve this problem. If they don't go together and work together to solve it, it won't get resolved. So where are we headed? Well, as I mentioned earlier, record emissions of 55 billion metric tons in 2019. Over half of these emissions were put in the atmosphere in the last 30 years. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, has recommended that the world strive to reach net zero by 2050. A large number of scientists around the world have determined that if that happens, we might be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, or no more than 2 degrees centigrade. This red line on the chart shows the current trend. So since the start of this century, we have increased to 55 billion metric tons, as I mentioned earlier. The prognosis is that with business as usual, nothing happened, no changes, we would reach 80 billion metric tons by 2050, twice the level of the year 2000. These numbers are really huge and they're very difficult to visualize. And one way to think about it is 1 billion metric tons is the weight of 150 million male African elephants. There's only 400,000 male African elephants in the world today. That gives you an idea what a giant number this is. The other thing I do want to mention is that if we reach 1 or 2 degrees centigrade, it may not seem like much of a temperature increase, but suppose that you woke up in the morning with a temperature increase of 2 degrees centigrade or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, a fever, in other words, of 102 degrees Fahrenheit, you could find yourself quite ill. Another thing we're concerned about, I should say, is that there's a possibility the world could cross or exceed a tipping point. A tipping point is a scientific term for something we might better know as a straw that broke the camel's back. In other words, it refers to some change of something that causes an effect to increase in magnitude and perhaps become irreversible. This could happen, for example, if with extensive warming of the oceans, we see more melting of Arctic ice, which causes the ocean level to rise, which causes more melting of Arctic ice, or release of methane from permafrost in the northern countries, Norway, Russia, the Arctic, Alaska. Permafrost controls the amount of methane that's stored. And if that gets into the atmosphere, we will see more warming. More warming would cause more melting of permafrost and so on. So anyway, enough said about that. But these are things that are a number of these that we're very concerned about and we're watching. So what do we do about this? In our book, we have developed an action plan. I'm going to just give a very quick summary of it here. There's 7 main actions. The first one is improving energy efficiency and conservation. And this is something I've followed very closely in my career over the last 40 plus years. Following the Arab oil embargo in 1973, the world undertook to improve energy use efficiency, and And over a number of decades, that has averaged about 2% per year. We believe it can be increased to 3% per year with some minor incentives and encouragement from the government. That will in itself reduce world energy use by 25% by 2050 at a very low cost. We need to produce all electricity with renewables, with solar and wind. That's already starting to happen. Solar energy and wind energy are cheaper than anything today other than natural gas for producing electricity. We need to electrify to the greatest extent possible the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. We also need to make a transition to electric vehicles to stop burning gasoline and diesel. And it's necessary to come up with some synthetic fuels for particularly aircraft, air transport, and shipping. Finally, we need to make changes in agriculture and stop deforestation and plant billions of trees to sequester carbon dioxide. So we think, Bill and I believe that it's too late to limit global warming to less than 1.5 degrees C or less than 2 degrees C, in fact. We think that unless we take action immediately, we're going to continue up on that red line curve. So we need to urgently start doing some things as outlined in our action plan. We've determined how much we could reduce global emissions if we implemented those 7 items on a global scale. And that's shown in the blue line. So we would be able to reduce global emissions back down to the level of the year 2000, about a 40% reduction from business as usual. And more importantly, that's a positive trend where the curve is turning downward. Now, we're not reaching net zero, obviously, but we think that this would be an important first start. It would get us moving in the right direction, and it would buy time for new developments, including such things as removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it safely underground. But the most important message that we want to leave you with is that it's urgent, it's real, and we need to start right now. So I'd like to stop at this point and turn it over to Bill for the balance of our presentation.
Thank you, Craig. So what do we do? What do we do now? At this point, we hope that all of us agree that global warming is a very serious problem that we have to solve, and we have to reach net zero as soon as we can. We believe that it can be done with the technology we have today. We don't need to invent anything. And there will be further cost reductions in the energy from renewables due to technical progress and to greater economies of scale. We are not pessimists. We believe that energy abundance based on renewable energy, not austerity, is an achievable objective. Our book includes a number of recommendations that should be done by government, industry, and individuals to reach net zero. However, we want to point out that if we don't do the big things, the small things, less impactful, no matter how commendable they are, will not stop global warming. They're basically spitting in the ocean, so to speak. The big things we have to do first, we need to educate the voting public so that they will support change. Today's presentation is part of that effort. Our politicians will say that they're in favor of doing something about global warming, but they will not support the meaningful changes we need to take unless the voting public is behind them. We think this is a big issue. A first step could be, in our opinion, that the government, US government, and other governments strongly state that global warming is a major threat and we can and should do something about it. A good example is the 1964 Surgeon General's report that linked cigarette smoking to lung cancer and other health effects. With that statement, some serious actions were taken to reduce cigarette smoking. Second, in our opinion, it's probably the biggest single action is to implement a carbon emissions fee. And this is not a tax, it's a fee to offset what is estimated by the UN to be a $5 trillion annual global subsidy for fossil fuel use. That's a huge number. The biggest subsidy by far is the ability to discharge unlimited quantities of greenhouse gases and other pollutants into the atmosphere for free. It shouldn't be free. We are in favor of a very simple, unavoidable fee applied at the wellhead or the mine. We are not in favor of more complex systems such as cap and trade that are complicated and easily gamed by politicians and special interests. The third item, which is Craig's alluded to, is that we need a coordinated international effort to stop global warming. If US or Europe did exactly what needs to be done, but others didn't follow it, it wouldn't work. We think that this has to include other countries such as Brazil and Indonesia, where most of the world's deforestation or forest destruction takes place. The US rejoining the Paris Agreement at the start of the Biden administration is a very good first step. And the US needs to actively support the Paris Agreement and participate in the leadership of the global effort. We also think the appointment of Secretary John Kerry to a new cabinet post to lead the US efforts to stop global warming is another very positive step. One thing we feel we can't forget is that a lot of damage has been done and future damage is unavoidable. A big part of our effort dealing with global warming has to be mitigation, which is coping with the damage associated with global warming and climate change. And no matter when we reach net zero, there'll be global warming due to latency and the sticky accelerator problem that Craig discussed. And the Earth's temperature will remain elevated for a very long time after we achieve net zero. In addition, the sea level will continue to rise, and there'll be other adverse effects due to global warming. For example, low-lying coastal areas will be severely affected. We will need what we call a managed retreat, in that a number of areas will have to be abandoned because they can't be saved. Global warming, another big issue, is there's a major, if not the most important, human rights issue in the world today. The poorest and most vulnerable people will be those who are affected first and affected most by global warming. We sitting here in Newport Beach are going to be among the last to be impacted by this. Many of these people will become what can be referred to as climate refugees, where they will have to move to a more hospitable locations. And in some cases, this will be across national boundaries, so it will obviously cause some problems. We are not pessimists. We believe that a bright future is possible if we take action now, but we can't waste any more time. We also believe that global warming's not a technical problem as much as having the political will to do what needs to be done. Abundant and affordable energy from renewables can support the world's population growth and rising living standards worldwide. Renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels and nuclear, and on a par with natural gas in most locations today, and they're getting cheaper by the day. A big bonus is that most air pollution would be eliminated if we stop using fossil fuels. Most countries have good potential for renewables, and many could achieve energy independence, including the United States. We're among the best endowed as far as renewable energy is concerned. Some of the least developed parts of the world, such as Africa, would have all the low-cost energy they would need for economic development. Much of the investment and the effort will come from the private sector, not from the government. In 2019, there was more investment in renewable energy around the world than there was in fossil fuels. So that's a very positive step. We like to say that the trend is our friend. We are moving in the right direction, but we're not moving fast enough or on a big enough scale. The biggest trend, as we've discussed, is the declining cost of electricity from solar and wind, and we can't emphasize that enough. Yes, there are problems in using electricity from solar and wind. However, there's huge economic incentives to upgrade the electric grid and make other changes that are needed to use this low-cost energy. Also, renewables are fuel-free. They don't need a fuel, and they're not subject to future fuel cost increases. The trend towards renewables is accelerating, with a growing share of the world's annual $2 trillion investment in energy being devoted to renewables over fossil fuels. I want to mention one of the things, all the world's auto producers, by the way, are in a race to develop electric vehicles, and it's estimated that over 200 new electric vehicle models will be introduced in the next 10 years. This is being done without any action on the part of the government. Some large fossil fuel companies, such as BP, are becoming clean energy companies. And then finally, the fossil fuel industry is losing access to capital. It's increasingly difficult for the fossil fuel industry to get financing or insurance for, let's say, a new coal-fired power plant. And in addition, many large investment management firms and pension funds like BlackRock are reducing their investment in traditional energy companies. President Biden has gotten off to a quick start. He signed an executive order rejoining the Paris Agreement and appointed Secretary Kerry to lead our efforts to fight global warming. He's stated that his administration will spend $2 trillion in the first term fighting global warming. The major objectives are to produce all electricity in the US by renewables by 2035, only 15 years from now, and to reach net zero, no greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Craig and I prefer definitely action over inaction, and we're very pleased to see the Biden administration committed to stopping global warming. However, we're in doubt. We doubt, as we stated earlier, that we can get to net zero by 2050. It's important that we start now and do the best we can, even if we can't meet that specific goal. We are concerned about big government programs that could lead to a lot of waste and end in failure. We don't want this effort to become a pork feast or another jobs program. One issue is, will China lead the world? Everybody's worried about what China's going to do, but China has huge incentives to eliminate fossil fuel use because of their own air pollution problem, energy independence, and a number of other issues. And presently, China is the world leader in production of electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar arrays, batteries for electric vehicles, and also for utility scale energy storage. They have half the world's high-speed rail, and they are now the world leader in the design and production of nuclear power plants. The US will have to match China's cost, technology, and manufacturing capability if we're going to create many of these green jobs in the US. We think China's a rival, but not necessarily an adversary. It's just a fact that we are in competition with China. In September 2020, a few months ago, President Xi, before the UN, stated that China will have their global greenhouse gas emissions peak by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2060. This is a very bold set of objectives for a country like China. Another important incentive for China is they see the renewable industries as major business opportunities, and they are moving aggressively to have leadership positions in these industries worldwide to help their economy grow. One thing we have to remind ourselves is, what if we do nothing or don't do enough? We believe we can stop global warming. However, failure is an option if we don't do enough. And if we don't do enough, CO2 and other greenhouse gas concentrations will continue to increase. The Earth's temperature will exceed 2 degrees C in about 25 years from now. 25 years from now, yes, and exceed 3 degrees, which is about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. The sea level will continue to rise and could exceed 3 feet by the end of the century. We are all living through the devastation caused by the coronavirus pandemic, which took the world by surprise. However, we will eventually have a vaccine and herd immunity to reduce the effects of the virus. We have to point out that with global warming, we've seen this problem develop over 30 years or more. It didn't take us by surprise, but we've ignored the warning signs. With global warming, there won't be a vaccine, and there is no solution except taking the actions that Craig identified to reach net zero. We don't see an alternative to that. So with that, we've taken a little more time than we thought, but I think we have time left over for some questions from the audience if you are interested.
Okay, I have a question. It says, is wind a long-term solution?
Craig, do you want to take it or do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Well, I think there's really three things. There's solar, there's wind. These are the renewable energy sources. And then there's synthetic fuel production, as Craig pointed out, for things like aircraft, where we don't think they'll necessarily be a practical alternative to fossil fuels for a long time. We've done a lot of work looking at can we power the US, can we power the world with wind and solar? And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, with solar arrays, I think the number is if you took 10% of the Sahara Desert, you could power the world. And there's a similar number for wind. A number we've calculated and we've seen recently is that 1 million wind turbines, which sounds like a lot, but it would power the United States. So yes, it could. And the other thing is that the U.S. is very well endowed with areas that are suitable for wind and solar. And I don't think it's solar or wind; it'd be a combination of the two. Some areas are very windy, and especially offshore and onshore, nearshore locations. And other areas are ideal for solar panels. So it'll be a combination of the two. One thing, a little vignette, we've looked at the Permian Basin in Texas, the biggest source of oil and gas in the United States. It's a land area the size of Minnesota, half the size of California. And that alone could produce more energy from wind and solar than it does from gas and oil if it was developed.
I might add to that, Bill, that in Texas has 25,000 megawatts of wind capacity installed already. You think of a large nuclear power plant, that's 1,000 megawatts. So that's equivalent to 25 large nuclear power plants. China right now is leading the world in wind. California leads the U.S. in solar, with I think Texas is second or third behind California. So there is a big trend already underway to invest in these renewable sources of energy.
And one issue too is that California, when you look at the numbers, is the best endowed state in the union for wind and solar, and Texas is number 2.
Great.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience. Diana, go ahead.
Is it really possible for solar power, renewables, and wind turbines to produce all the world's energies? And will it be as cost effective as fossil fuels?
We have looked at powering the world with solar and wind, and we believe it could be done in theory with either. Either would be enough to provide adequate power for the future. But that would not happen. It would be a combination of both. And some new thinking about such things. For example, there is a huge infrastructure investment in oil and natural gas, pipelines, refineries, tankers, conversion to liquefied natural gas and so on to provide energy to countries that don't have those resources. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to picture huge solar farms in the Middle East providing electricity to Europe, for example. It would be easier and cheaper because there would be no fuel cost to do that compared to what we're doing today. So I think the answer, I believe, is that we can power the world with wind and solar.
This is interesting in the broad vision, but what can individuals do? I mean, we can hope our country does something, but shall we all plant a tree? I mean, what do we do?
Okay, can I answer that, Bill?
Yeah, go ahead now.
All right, thank you. That's a very good question. Liz, is that correct here?
Yes.
Okay, Liz, thank you for asking that question. That's an important question. Bill mentioned earlier that if we don't do the big things, the little things don't matter. But still, there's a lot we can do on a personal level. I just want to summarize a few based on my own personal experience. The first thing you could think of is go through your house, get rid of every incandescent lamp, convert everything to LEDs. The advantage of that is your electric bill will drop noticeably just from changing lamps. And the other advantage is, especially for people like Bill and I, who don't like to get up on ladders anymore, they'll never, ever have to change a light bulb again as long as you live. I guarantee you. LEDs are amazing. And the cost has come down so much that that's one thing anybody can do. Secondly, if you're going to buy a new appliance, make sure it's an Energy Star appliance. It's really remarkable what changes have happened in major appliances in the last 20 years, particularly in California. In fact, it's been driven by California Energy Commission. The amount of electricity to operate a refrigerator has gone down by a factor of 4 in the last several decades. And interestingly, they're cheaper too for a given size. So Energy Star appliances, consider carefully an electric vehicle if that scares you. Get a hybrid. Honda Prius, 50 miles per gallon. Unbelievable savings when you think about it and reduced emissions. One thing about electric vehicles, there's going to be an increasing movement to put charging stations all over the world. And so soon you'll find that it's not going to be a concern about running out of electricity on a trip. More expensive on a bigger scale would be rooftop solar. I'll just give you my personal experience. One of the, I think, probably few houses in Newport that has rooftop solar. I put it on in 2003, worked perfectly up to now. No problems along the way, still working fine. My annual electric bill is $250. That's per year.
Who do you recommend?
For
Rooftop solar.
Yeah, I don't know who's really the leaders at this point, because I did this a number of years ago. There are a number of companies. You can go on the website of the California Energy Commission and they will give you some alternative companies and ratings and consumer reports type information.
I mean, two points. One is personal act. What can we do? I think the biggest thing we can do is support political action. And get the word out. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. Is we think that the public is very poorly educated, and that the press and others have not done a good job. And we hope our presentation was a clear statement of the problem. And if we get more presentations, we'd love to do that. But the big thing is do the big things and support, I think, the Biden administration and John Kerry and others. Also, I'm very worried that our big global warming initiative, we could throw money at the problem and it'd be a lot of waste and it'd turn out to be a big jobs program. So I think that to support the big things, political action, and making sure that the money is well spent is a big deal. And also educating your friends and getting the word out. One thing I'd like to go back to the other question on, can we power the world? The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, if you look at how much power the world has, and Craig and I have these calculations, you know, with a small fraction of the wind potential or the solar potential available in the world, you can easily power the world, and the US can be energy independent. And the other one is, can we afford it? And there's two things I'd like to mention. One is that we can't emphasize enough that nuclear power and coal and oil and natural gas aren't getting cheaper. But solar energy, because of technology and economies of scale, has dropped in price and cost dramatically in the last 30 years and is continuing to decline. So it's going to be cheaper and cheaper in the future. And the other one is, can we afford it? The world spends $2 trillion a year on energy investments, that power plants, transmission lines, and oil terminals and things like that. And you figure if we're talking about getting to net zero over the next 30 years, that $60 trillion will be spent on energy on a global basis. And that's plenty of money to do what needs to be done. So it's, we think that we could easily prove that going renewable is probably the cheapest option for the future.
Yeah, can I add to that, Bill?
Yeah.
That you brought up a very good point, and that is power plants typically have an operating life of 40 years or so. And a lot of existing fossil fuel plants are reaching the end of their lives, particularly coal plants. Nobody's building new coal plants. So as those plants are retired, the utilities or the companies that own them are going to build a new plant. And so that they're going to make that investment anyway. So it's not like we suddenly have to come up with a whole bunch of more money. Those plants will be retired and they will be replaced. That's part of the process that's going to happen anyway.
Question, what has your research shown on the dryness that is reported in the Middle East, and not the Far East, but the Middle East countries, that they are having difficulty growing crops for the food for those countries, and consequently migration to other countries?
Well, can I answer that one?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Susie and I have traveled extensively in the Middle East over the last 50 years, and we lived in Saudi Arabia for a while. So we've been to places like Syria and Yemen and as well as Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, these are countries that are rich because they've got oil and gas, and their future is going to be severely impacted by global warming if the world doesn't need their oil and gas. And the other thing is they're largely arid desert areas. And when we talk about climate refugees and others, I mean, the Middle East and parts of North Africa are going to be parts of the world that are going to be affected first and affected most by global warming. And what little agricultural potential they have is going to be compromised. And so I think that that's just a wave of the future that, you know, in the Middle East, we will be generating a lot of refugees and they'll have to leave. And that's going to be a major international issue.
We've noticed in London that visiting there years back, it was the population was, it seemed that they were able to handle it. But now London is so crowded, and a lot of Middle Easterners are flooding there.
Yeah.
And it's really affecting England. And I assume that other countries will be expected to have to accept some of these refugees for their livelihood.
Well, I don't think that you'll have a choice. I mean, I think it's going to be a very difficult situation. They're also going to get a lot of immigrants from North Africa as well. And that's I think that Europe has a problem somewhat analogous to our southern border, only worse in my mind. Oscar, you were asking about nuclear power. Do you want to go back to that one? Because I think Craig and I both have a lot of experience in our early careers were spent in the nuclear power industry. I was
Sure. The question was, should we be building more nuclear power plants?
Well, let me tell you, Craig and I were involved with nuclear power in the very early days, which would be the early 60s. I was in the nuclear Navy and Rickover's organization designing nuclear power plants for ships. And then I worked in the commercial nuclear power industry. Craig is a PhD in nuclear engineering and has done a lot of work in the industry as well. So we've seen the rise and fall of nuclear power. It was supposed to be a swords into plowshares effort, started with the Eisenhower administration to take the terrible nuclear weapons technology and convert it into a civilian use. And it was very successful. We built over 100 large commercial nuclear power plants in this country. However, I think economics is killing it. Nuclear power plants are very expensive to build. Siting's a big issue. No one wants to live near a nuclear power plant. We shut down San Onofre south of us 8 years ago or so. And no one would agree to build another nuclear power plant on that site. So there's still a big issue on siting. And the other thing is this disposal of spent nuclear fuel. The government has had that responsibility for over 50 years and has yet to come up with a solution. All of the fuel used in nuclear reactors in the US for the last 50 years is still stored on site, including San Onofre. There is no plan to process and store that in any other location. So we feel that already natural gas is cheaper than nuclear power, and solar and wind are getting cheaper than that. So we don't see a future for nuclear power, frankly. And we feel we can meet our green energy goals without it. I don't know, Craig, if you.
Well, I would just add a couple things. There is a lot of research going on building or designing new safe, quote unquote, nuclear power plants, smaller size, and so on. But the very issues that Bill just raised still will apply. Siting, where are you going to put them? Cooling water, how do you get the cooling water? So I think the prospects that even if these new designs seem to go forward, I don't see that they're going to be implemented. And let's see, the other thing I want to mention was in terms of radioactive waste and storage of fuel and all that, the government spent billions of dollars building a facility in Nevada that still, for political reasons, has not been made available. So that's an ongoing problem.
One last point that we need to emphasize, that we haven't built a new nuclear power plant in this country in over 30 years. So all of the plants in operation are over 30 years old and will be retired in the next 10 to 20 years. So we're probably going to lose nuclear power plants going forward. That's another thing we have to take into account, that we will use less nuclear power going forward, or there will be less available.
Yeah, and one other thing I meant to mention was that there is one nuclear power plant under construction in the U.S. right now in the Southeast. It's behind schedule. It's way over budget. And the thing about nuclear power, the positive thing is that it doesn't emit greenhouse gases. So I think what I would recommend as a future course is that we should continue the existing plants as long as it's safe to do so. Some of them have had their licenses extended. Some of them had modifications made to enable them to continue operating. I think in the minimum, we should continue to operate the ones that can be operated safely for as long as possible, because they do not emit greenhouse gases. That's the one redeeming factor.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I have a nuclear question for you. You have a comment, I think there's Bill Gates has a on hold project with China to generate electricity by using spent rods. And that may go forward now that there's administration change, because it's been frozen for the last 4 years. Do you have any data on that or comment?
You know, we have no objection to further development and research on nuclear power. I mean, we're not saying that it's dangerous and shouldn't be used, but the other practical matter is, you know, if you're starting out with a new nuclear technology, you've got to develop it, then you've got to come up with a build a large scale prototype to demonstrate the economics and the safety of it. And then once that's demonstrated, then you've got to get licensing approval to build commercial plants. You know, if we came up with something tomorrow, it would take 20 years, in my guess. I mean, it's not an estimate, it's a guess, before it would have an impact, be in a large enough scale. And I just think that what we see with solar and wind getting cheaper and more ubiquitous, what's going to kill nuclear power is the economics. Wind and solar is going to be so much cheaper to build and so much cheaper to operate that we won't need it. That's a guess, not a. I mean, that's sort of my forecast.
I'm going to advance another question because, like you say, it takes so long to get those things approved. That's why he negotiated a project with China rather than doing it domestically, and it's to use rods in China to generate electricity. But going back to solar and wind, for peak power demands, then you get into the capacity to store. Now, where does the battery? Can we talk a little bit about where the battery fits in?
Well, I just say that wind and solar are intermittent sources of energy. We all know that the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. Weather can affect solar output, and likewise with wind. The one thing about wind, the wind does blow at night, so that's the difference. But there is a need for energy storage. We actually have a very large energy storage system today in the United States and in many other countries. What it is pumped hydro. That is a system whereby water flows downhill from dams and turns a generator during the day when power is needed. And then at night when it's not needed, it's pumped back uphill and stored. It's a energy storage system. But there is a huge global development process underway now to come up with utility size batteries, storage batteries that can during the day excess energy and make it available at night when solar or wind is not generating. California has actually been in a position where they had to dispose of solar energy during the day because they generated more than could be used. So that points out the need to have an adequate storage system. Yeah,
I'd mention a couple of things there. One is that if you look at the technologies moving forward, battery technology has lagged solar and wind developments so far, but there's a huge effort to come up with better batteries. And there's a huge incentive because the move towards electric vehicles is going to create a huge demand for battery, cost-effective batteries, and a lot of money is being put into that investment. So battery technology is catching up. The other thing that's happening is there's a lot of interesting things that people are doing that don't meet the press. When you come to energy storage, several of the large solar and wind projects are using excess energy production during the day to produce hydrogen gas. And then they store the hydrogen gas and they can burn it in a turbine when needed to produce peak power or power at night in terms of solar. And in Europe, there's a move to repurpose part of the pipelines to be able to transport hydrogen instead of methane. So when electricity gets cheap enough from renewables, we're going to start to see the development of what I would call the hydrogen economy. We can use hydrogen as well as batteries as a source of evening out the supply and demand problem.
I think you've already answered my question,
Yeah.
but one of my friends wanted to ask, does the government need to spend trillions of dollars to fight global warming?
I would say, I mean, the point I made earlier, I mean, I'm worried about spending $2 trillion in 4 years on global warming. You know, we had a $900 billion stimulus bill approved in December, and it was 5,600 pages long. That's 11 pages per congressman, if you want to think of it that way. And, you know, the Biden plan as presented before the election had a lot of things about green energy jobs and you know, and it could become, my worry is that we could waste a lot of money, and we're not spending money, we're going into debt because there is no money. I mean, all of the trillions that we're spending is deficit financed, which is a big problem in my mind, but a separate problem. I think that right now we're spending $2 trillion a year on a global basis on energy. And starting in 2019, more of those dollars was spent on renewables and fossil fuels. And I think that there will definitely be some things that the government can do better than anybody else, maybe building a transmission network across the country similar to the National Highway Program, let's say, to get transmission, to get energy from where it's generated the best to where it's needed the most. But I don't think we need to have a $2 trillion crash effort. And I would be worried that that money will not be well spent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What Bill's saying, if you look at the details of the bill, and again, it's changing. It's not anything cast in concrete at this point, I don't believe. But I remember one of the elements of the early bill was, I think, government would install 50,000 charging stations around the country or some number like that. I don't think that's necessary. I mean, the utilities are going to do that. Tesla's already done that. People are going to see that's a need and there's a way to fulfill it and they can make money doing it. So why would we need the government to do that? Maybe the government could provide a small incentive or encouragement. Likewise, as Bill mentioned, we need to upgrade our national utility grid. We were tempted to call it a dumb grid, and we need a smart grid. The grid as it exists today, for the most part, was built to take power from large central power plants and distribute it to a bunch of smaller users. What we're facing today is a need to integrate many sources of energy, from my rooftop to the big solar farm up near Lancaster, and then get that out to different users, and at the same time provide storage and ways to adjust things when the demand shifts or weather happens or part of it has to be shut down due to fire risk and so on. So we need basically a smart grid. And this is starting to happen, but things like that are the things where the federal government could play an important role because it's got to cross over state boundaries, a whole plethora of different regulatory environments, and somebody's got to step in and smooth the way to make it all happen. So there's a role for the federal government, but like Bill said, just dumping money on is probably not going to be effective.
One thing we could mention, talking about transmission, is Texas. Texas has done some things right.
Yeah.
And if you can think of Texas, they've got huge cities in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Austin. And then you go to the West Texas where there's nothing but jackrabbits and wind and dust. But that's where the oil is coming from, the Permian Basin. And quite a few years ago, the utility control, ERCOT, they call it in Texas, invested $7 billion in transmission lines to connect West Texas to the load centers at Dallas and Houston and places like that. And that's led to an explosion because now you can build wind farms and solar farms in dusty and windy and sunny West Texas and get the power to where it's needed. And we think that that's a scale model, let's say, of what needs to be done nationally. I mean, we need to be able to get that power not to just Houston and Dallas, we need to get it to Chicago. As we, so I think the government has a big role if we can identify the bottlenecks and eliminate them. And I think that private enterprise and private capital will do most of the heavy lifting.
We have a question from Liz in the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, this is Think Globally. I want to ask about Act Locally. You guys wrote a book. If I bought 10 books, who should I send them to that would have the most impact to act globally?
Well, Liz, that's a wonderful suggestion. We would appreciate that. I do want to explain one thing. The book costs you damn much. We're trying to get the publisher to lower the price.
Well, I'm aware of that. So
we do have a code. We have a secret code that will give you a big discount. But the other thing is, Bill and I, we're not in this for making money.
Well, I think that's true.
We have a plan. We're going to, any royalties or whatever we get, we're using that to give books to school districts and so on. So our target would be primarily trying to get it into middle schools and high schools, because those are the people, those kids and those science teachers and environmental teachers are the ones that are going to be most affected, and they need to know as much as possible. But I'll tell you this, if you buy 10 books, I'll give you some of the money.
So I don't want some of the money. I want, what if I just give you the money and at your cost, you send, or, what you pay for your books is less than what I pay for your books. And the point is to get your books somewhere. So if I give you the money for that and shipping or whatever, will that facilitate your sending the books to the middle schools you want to send them to?
Absolutely, that'd be a wonderful thing, and we'll make it attractive.
All right, well, Bill, we can talk about this.
Yes, that would be very kind of you. And one other thing I wanted to go back to.
Spread the word, right? Spread the word, isn't that what?
Spread the word, that's the key thing. Another thing, and your question, what can we do? I forgot one thing. There is a group, a local group, that has groups throughout Southern California, well, throughout the world, actually. It's called the Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL. They have a big website, you can look at it. The local branch here in Orange is very active. They've been working for a good 10 years with Congress to get Congress to consider putting a price on carbon. That's kind of their key thing. But whether you exactly agree with what they're wanting to do or not, they have been very effective in getting Congress to wake up to some of the problems. And they normally meet once a month on a Saturday. Today, they're doing it all by Zoom. If anybody on this call would be interested in sitting in on one of their meetings, you could contact Bill or I, and we could give you a connection. But I think in terms of, they have very active efforts to communicate to Congress people and
Cover it, Bill.
follow up, that sort of thing.
Yeah, one other thing we should mention, we have a website called reachingnetzero.com, and we're two guys doing this all by ourselves with a little help. And so we're also trying to spread the word on the internet using this website, and we're writing blog posts on things like nuclear power and can renewable energy power the world. So we're trying to do more than just get our book out to get the word out.
Can you contribute to the lobby group?
Yes.
Yes, you can. They have two parts, as it were. The lobby itself is like any lobby. It's not tax deductible, but they'd be very happy to have you give them some money. They have an education branch also, and any deduction, any contributions to that are tax deductible. And I think that's a worthwhile cause. I've given them $1,000 every year for the last several years because of all the educational outreach that they do with kids and people all around the world. So I think it's worthwhile, even if you don't. I'll tell you exactly what Bill and my reservation is with this. We like everything they're talking about, but their bill, it's called House Resolution 763. I think it's got a new number now because of the new Congress, but if you look HR 763, you can read about it. And that bill urges Congress to pass a law to put a fee on carbon at the mine and at the wellhead of, let's say, $15 a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that would come. In other words, so many barrels of oil, generates so many tons of carbon dioxide, and the oil company would have to pay the federal government $15 for every ton. Those are the approximate numbers. Then the federal government, according to this bill, would turn around and distribute that money back to every family in the U.S., 100%. So it would become like a big Social Security payment, if you will. That's the part that Bill and I don't like. We think that the majority of that money ought to be given back to, or used to support new power projects, the transmission line improvements, whatever the things that we think are necessary. And a fraction of that should go to families that have low-income families that might be impacted by the fact that gasoline costs 20 cents more a gallon or things of that nature. So there would be an impact on low-income families over the short term while these changes take place. But hell, you and I and Bill, we don't need any money back from that. So that's our one thing. By the way, Canada has done this now for about 10 years. And they generate, I saw the reports for last year, Canada generated about $1 trillion, a couple billion dollars Canadian from fossil fuel fees. And they give part of that back to low-income families to help offset any rising costs the families experience. But most of it they're using for programs to support green energy.
We've run over, but I hope that that we've kept your interest, and we appreciate the audience. One thing I would say, if you have any comments for or against on how Craig and I could improve our presentation, you've got our emails, so please let us know. And if you have further questions, you can ask us anything, anytime, and we'll get back to you. And we are looking for other opportunities to give our presentation. We do have a date set up. Is it, Craig, in April rather, for the Bowers Museum? We're going to give a presentation, and we're looking for other opportunities.
One presentation could be given at OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And they do things like this, have series on hot topics.
Okay, good.
That's a good suggestion. I'm familiar with that. Yeah, Bill, we should look into that.
Yeah.
And we should.
And what about in the library?
I think we need to go right over to Liz's house tonight too.
Collect the money while we can, yeah.
Thank you all. Really appreciate the comments.
Oasis gives several programs too, the senior center. So you might, I don't know who to contact there. Maybe Bob would know, but they seem to have timely topics and presentations from time to time too. And they have
Well, that's another good suggestion. And we are trying to get something going at the Newport Library. We haven't heard back from them yet.
Okay.
What is that?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We always appreciate an audience, and we want to get the word out. So we really appreciate your comments.
Let's get the word out.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.